He forged her signature, stole her most passionate project, dragged her name through accusations of plagiarism, and left her bankrupt, all to justify it with the words, "I did it because I loved you." You think she crumbled for good? She did not. She turned the ashes into power, and now she is the one dragging him into the light. This is not just a journey for justice. It is the rebirth of a soul that was once set on fire. The rain had just stopped falling when Sarah Watson arrived at the construction site, boots muddied from her walk through the newly cleared garden path. Morning light filtered through the damp trees, casting pale reflections on the surface of the glass pavilion her team had nearly completed. She stood still for a moment, silently admiring the curvature of the timber beams, the way the structure seemed to breathe with the landscape rather than resist it. It was not just a building. It was an extension of the forest itself, designed to vanish and emerge with the shifting of seasons. Sarah had always seen architecture as more than design. For her, it was a language, a kind of poetry carved into the land. Each project she took on carried an intimate pulse, gentle, deliberate, human. She was known for her insistence on sustainable materials, for collaborating with local artisans, and for the quiet, soulful spaces she created, buildings that healed rather than conquered. Colleagues described her as private, even elusive. She never sought the spotlight, rarely attended networking events unless absolutely necessary, and often preferred the quietude of her sketchbooks over the crowded brilliance of award ceremonies. But when she spoke about her work, her voice held a calm certainty that disarmed skeptics and charmed clients. Her romantic nature, so evident in her designs, extended quietly into her personal life. She believed in the sincerity of gestures, a handwritten letter, the weight of silence after a meaningful look, the way a hand resting on someone's shoulder could convey volumes. Her capacity for trust was deep, almost naive, but she wore it without shame. Daniel Moreau had entered her life at a design gala 3 years earlier. He was magnetic in a room, the kind of man who made people shift subtly in his direction without knowing why. His interest in Sarah had seemed genuine. He spoke of his admiration for her work, for her vision, for the calm strength she carried. When he offered to invest in her first solo firm, it felt less like a transaction and more like an alignment of dreams. "People like you," he had said during one of their first late-night conversations as they sat beside the fire in his lakeside retreat, "you remind me that the world is still worth rebuilding." Sarah had smiled at him then, believing that she had found someone who not only believed in her work, but in her. Someone who would walk beside her, not ahead of her. Someone she could trust. At the time, she had no reason to doubt him, not yet. The months that followed were filled with sunlight and recognition. Sarah's name began appearing more frequently in architectural journals. She was invited to speak at symposiums, to consult on international projects, to lend her quiet authority to conversations about sustainability and ethical design. The pavilion in the forest, her flagship project, was nominated for a major European award. At every step, Daniel was there, smiling at her side, shaking hands with dignitaries, speaking with practiced ease about Sarah's vision as if it were also his. They moved into a restored townhouse near the river, a space with raw brick walls and a studio bathed in morning light. Sarah filled it with books, plants, and handmade furniture. Daniel filled it with plans, contacts, and phone calls. At first, the balance felt natural. He took care of the logistics, negotiating contracts, managing client relations, while she immersed herself in creation. He had more experience with the business side of things, he said. It made sense to let him filter out the noise so she could focus. Only later would Sarah recognize how carefully he had begun to rearrange the architecture of her world. She noticed it in subtle shifts, an invitation to an alumni dinner somehow never reaching her, a close friend and fellow architect, Leah, who stopped calling without explanation, financial documents that were suddenly handled through Daniel's office, where her access was now limited for efficiency. He always smiled when explaining these things, never dismissive, always logical, always wrapped in a tone of care. "I just want to make things easier for you," he would say, "so you can do what you do best." And perhaps that was what troubled her most. He said all the right things, touched her shoulder at the right moments, held her hand in public like a man in love. But more and more, she began to feel like a guest in her own life, celebrated, admired, but strangely distant from the people and decisions that had once grounded her. It was Camille who noticed first. They met for lunch in a quiet cafe in the 5th arrondissement, a place they used to frequent as students. Camille arrived with wind-tossed hair, a thick scarf slung carelessly around her neck, and eyes that had seen too many truths. She listened patiently as Sarah spoke about the award nomination, the townhouse, the studio light. Then she leaned back and said with characteristic directness, "When did you stop laughing?" Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" "I do not know," Camille replied, stirring her espresso. "You sound curated, like someone wrote your life for you. I used to hear your voice and know where your fire was. Now I just see your photo on magazine pages and wonder if you remember who you are." Sarah wanted to dismiss it. She wanted to laugh and say Camille was being dramatic or cynical. But instead, she sat there, hands curled around her cup, eyes staring out at the gray streets, wondering why those words struck a chord so deep it echoed. Something somewhere had shifted. And though it was still just a faint line on the surface, a hairline crack in polished glass, she could not unsee it anymore. That night, back in the townhouse, Sarah stood in the middle of her studio and stared at the drafting table where her latest design lay half-finished. The lines, once so fluid and certain, now felt foreign. Her pen had not touched the page in days. Camille's words lingered like the faint smell of smoke after a fire, haunting, persistent. She told herself it was just fatigue, just the pressure of visibility, of success. But the unease had already taken root. Days passed, and then a week. The sense of distance between herself and her own life deepened. A client she had worked with directly for months suddenly insisted on routing all communications through Daniel. A longtime collaborator sent a curt message withdrawing from a shared proposal. No explanation given. Sarah tried to make sense of it, but every answer she grasped seemed to vanish before it took shape. Until the envelope arrived. It was plain, sealed with a strip of tape, no return address. Inside were copies of financial statements, contract revisions, and one chilling signature. Hers. She stared at the documents for a long time before realizing her hands were trembling. The projects listed were unfamiliar, the terms misrepresented, and the sums involved staggered. Somehow, someone had used her name, her identity, to authorize a complex web of transactions that now tied her to investments she had never approved, risks she had never considered. Her breath caught. She called Daniel immediately. He was calm when he answered, as if he had expected this moment. "Sarah," he said gently, "you sound upset." She could barely form the words. "What is this? Why is my name on these?" A pause. Then, "I meant to tell you, it was going to be temporary, a technicality. We needed to act quickly, and I knew you would approve if you had been there. You forged my name." Her voice was low but sharp with disbelief. "You signed contracts—" "I protected you," he interrupted, still measured. "You do not understand the financial risks involved in this level of work. I could not let you sabotage yourself out of fear." It was as though she had fallen through a pane of glass, and everything around her now shimmered with sharp, invisible edges. She barely registered the rest of his words. Something about strategy, about perception, about how things would be fine if she just let it pass, let him fix it. But what echoed in her mind, louder than anything he said, was not the fraud, not yet. It was the certainty in his voice, the unshakable confidence with which he had taken what belonged to her and bent it into something he could use. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in the darkness of her studio, lit only by the amber glow of the street lamp through the tall windows, and scrolled through her archived emails, financial records, project histories. The deeper she looked, the more her world unraveled. The assistant, Clémence, had always seemed too deferential, too present. Late-night messages, unexplained meetings, a lipstick stain on a shirt Sarah had chosen not to question. Now, with her eyes open, everything was clear. The affair had not been sudden. It had been long, calculated, and shielded by 1,000 small lies disguised as kindness. By morning, Sarah was no longer confused. She was devastated, but she was awake. The days that followed blurred into a muted procession of silence and cold light. Sarah stopped answering calls. She stopped returning emails. The studio gathered dust. The award nomination she had once whispered about with trembling pride went unacknowledged, its ceremony date passing like a stranger's birthday. At night, sleep came only in fragments, 20-minute stretches of darkness pierced by sharp, jarring awakenings. Her chest ached with a weight she could not name, and every sound outside her window, footsteps, engines, distant voices, felt like an accusation. There were moments, fleeting but real, when she stood at the window ledge of the townhouse and looked down at the dark water curling through the canal below, wondering if letting go might be the only way to stop the spinning. But she never stepped forward. Something always held her back. Perhaps it was cowardice, or perhaps it was that thin, unbroken thread of something she had not yet defined. Rage, maybe. Or the stubborn, echoing refusal to let him be the one who decided how her story ended. One morning, she packed a small suitcase. No goodbye note, no forwarding address. She left the townhouse key on the kitchen table and walked away from everything she had built with her bare hands and blind trust. The train ride out of the city was quiet. Faces passed her like shadows. She got off somewhere she had not planned, in a village marked only by a wooden sign overgrown with ivy. From the station, she walked until her shoes were soaked with dew, and the noise of the city had finally vanished from her ears. Henri and Margot's cottage sat at the edge of a field bordered by trees. She had found their advertisement weeks ago, back when she still believed she would never need it. Live-in help wanted, garden and general upkeep, quiet setting, room provided. Margot opened the door without questions. She simply looked at Sarah, took in the pale face and the downcast eyes, and nodded. "You look like you need the earth more than we do," she said softly. And so, Sarah began to disappear. She woke at dawn to tend the soil, her fingers raw from pulling weeds, her back sore from carrying firewood. She spoke little, moved slowly, and allowed herself to shrink. Days passed, then weeks. The sky shifted from gray to green to gold as summer deepened, but inside her, nothing yet grew. Until one morning, while she was pruning a row of lavender by the back fence, a butterfly landed on her wrist. She stared at it for a long time, breath held, not out of wonder, but because she realized it was the first thing she had felt in days that was not pain. In the silence, something within her stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something quieter. The beginning of attention, the beginning of presence. And with that, without fully knowing it, Sarah began the slow, painful return to herself. The rhythm of the countryside wrapped around Sarah like a soft, weathered quilt. There were no alarms, no deadlines, no curated interviews or rooms filled with applause. There was only the sound of wind moving through grass, the creak of old wood, the slow hush of rain against slate roofs. At first, her hands had shaken when she held a pencil. She had not drawn since the unraveling began, and for a long time, she thought she never would again. But one quiet afternoon, as she sat on the worn bench beneath the plum tree, her fingers reached instinctively for a scrap of paper. No lines, just curves, organic shapes, the silhouette of a greenhouse made of glass and living vines. It came without thought, like breathing. That night, she found an old notebook tucked in the back of her suitcase. Its pages smelled faintly of graphite and cedar. She opened to a blank one and began to write. Not for clarity, not for answers, just to release what had remained locked inside her chest. Words came slowly at first, heavy and awkward. But as the days passed, they loosened. Grief turned to questions. Questions turned to memory. And in those memories, something unexpected began to flicker. Defiance. She started sketching again, this time not buildings but fragments, staircases that led nowhere, broken columns with ivy curling around them, doors half open in places that did not exist. They were wounded structures, imperfect and quiet but honest. For the first time in months, she was telling the truth. In the evenings, she helped Margot prepare dinner. They rarely spoke during the day, each respecting the other's silence. But at night, as candles flickered low and the fire hissed gently, Margot would pour 2 cups of herbal tea, and they would sit across from one another like survivors in a shared trench. One evening, Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "Did it ever stop hurting?" Margot looked into her cup for a long time before answering. "No, it changes shape. It becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you." Sarah waited. Then, in the quiet that followed, Margot added, "My son betrayed me, you know. He forged my signature to sell the land I was born on. For money, he never kept. He died 2 years later. I never forgave him. But I stopped letting that be the only thing I remembered about him." There was no pity in her voice, no attempt to comfort. Only the dry, grounding honesty of someone who had walked through fire and made peace with the burn marks. Sarah did not respond, but something inside her shifted, an imperceptible click, like the turning of a key she had not known was still in her hand. The next morning, she walked out to the garden with clearer breath. The light felt sharper, the soil more forgiving beneath her nails. As she crouched among the tomatoes, a single thought passed through her like a pulse. "I am still here." It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was just after the first frost when Sarah returned to the town's small post office, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck and a letter in her coat pocket. She had written it over the course of 3 evenings, her handwriting small and deliberate, each word measured like a beam, tested for weight. It was addressed to Camille. She did not say much, only what needed to be said, that she was alive, that she was ready to speak, that there were things buried under Daniel's success that needed to be unearthed, not for vengeance, but for the sake of truth. Camille's response came swiftly, as if the letter had been expected. A folded note arrived tucked inside a manila envelope. "Whenever you are ready, I am already working." Beneath it were copies of bank transfers, names Sarah did not recognize, and a detailed breakdown of dates linked to her forged signature. Camille, true to her nature, had never stopped digging. They met a week later in the city, this time in a quiet tea house tucked behind a bookstore. Camille looked older, sharper, her features more angular with time, but her eyes had not changed. "I knew he was bad," she said, pushing a thin folder across the table, "but I did not know how deep it went. You were just the most visible casualty, Sarah. He has left others behind, quiet, broken, and too ashamed to speak." Sarah turned the pages slowly. A software engineer bankrupted by a fake startup partnership. A young artist whose gallery Daniel had bought and gutted, claiming creative rights to her work. Investors drawn in by his charm and left with nothing but debt. She could feel the cold returning to her hands, the same chill she had felt that night in her studio, when everything began to fall apart. Camille took a sip of her tea. "You need someone who knows the law, someone who is not afraid to dig deeper than journalism will allow." Sarah nodded. The name came to her without hesitation, Marcel Duray, her former mentor, a man who had once told her, "Precision is not only for architecture, it is for justice." She had not spoken to him in years, not since he retired and disappeared into the countryside with his wife and his books. It took her 2 days to find him and half a day's train ride to reach his cottage. He opened the door, wearing thick glasses and an old sweater stained with ink. At first, he simply looked at her. Then he opened his arms. Inside, the fire was low and the room smelled faintly of tobacco and lemon oil. Sarah sat across from him, the folder on the table between them. She explained everything, not just what Daniel had done to her, but what Camille had found, what others had suffered. Marcel listened without interruption. When she finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "I had hoped I would not see your name tied to something like this," he said, "but I am glad you came." "Will you help me?" she asked, her voice quieter than she expected. "I will," he replied, "but you must understand this will not end with punishment. If you do this, it must be for something greater than getting even." Sarah nodded. "I want truth, not just mine, all of it." And with that, something fundamental shifted. The passivity of grief was gone. In its place was a deliberate, precise momentum. She had buried herself in the quiet of earth and silence long enough. Now it was time to dig elsewhere, into ledgers, into contracts, into memories that others had been paid to forget. Justice, she understood now, was not a feeling. It was a structure, and she was ready to begin building it. The work began in long, quiet hours at Marcel's kitchen table, with stacks of documents and timelines marked in pencil. Camille joined them when she could, bringing boxes of files and fresh insight. The three formed an unlikely alliance, part legal team, part reckoning committee, and together they began to trace the architecture of Daniel's deceit. It was Camille who introduced Elias. "He was one of the first to speak out," she said over the phone, "but no one listened. He might not trust easily, but he knows more than anyone." They met in a cafe near the river, one of those places with fogged windows and chairs that creaked with memory. Elias was younger than Sarah expected, late 30s perhaps, with dark hair pulled back and a face that looked like it had once known joy, but had not worn it in a while. His handshake was firm, but his eyes held a simmering anger that never quite settled. "I lost everything," he said simply, without preamble. "I mortgaged my apartment to invest in a clean energy partnership Daniel pitched to me over dinner. It was a lie. He used my designs, gutted the funding, and vanished. I spent a year trying to rebuild. No one wanted to hire an engineer who fell for a scam." Sarah listened carefully, trying to separate his story from the heat in his voice. He had every reason to be bitter, but bitterness, she had learned, was a poor compass. When she asked if he would work with them to gather more testimonies, he agreed immediately. His knowledge was valuable. He had technical reports, emails, early blueprints, all of which aligned with the patterns Sarah and Marcel had uncovered. But their collaboration was not seamless. Elias wanted exposure, headlines, a televised reckoning. He wanted Daniel's face on every screen, every page, every courtroom wall. He wanted the world to know. "I am not interested in quiet justice," he said one night as they reviewed a timeline. "He used our silence as a shield. I want him stripped bare." Sarah paused, pencil in hand. "I want the truth," she said carefully. "I want what is provable, what will stand in a courtroom, not what will go viral." He scoffed. "So you want a verdict, not a reckoning?" "I want both," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But the truth is not a weapon. If we use it like one, we become a part of his game." That night, she walked back to Marcel's alone, the air cold against her skin, her thoughts louder than the wind. She did not resent Elias. His rage was honest, but it made her question her own motivations. Was she seeking justice to restore balance, or to satisfy the hollow ache of betrayal? Was she building a case or sharpening a blade? At the edge of the field, she stopped and looked up. The stars were faint behind a thin veil of cloud, but they were there, constant, indifferent, unshaken. She whispered, not to the sky but to herself, "I will not become him." And with that, she let the anger slip. Not fully, not forever, but enough. Enough to remember who she was and what this fight was meant to be. The trial opened on a Thursday morning beneath an unforgiving sky. Clouds hung low and heavy over the courthouse, mirroring the quiet tension that gripped the city. Reporters clustered behind barricades, their cameras trained on the building's stone facade, as if waiting for it to crack open and spill secrets. Sarah stepped out of the car with Marcel beside her, his presence a steady weight at her shoulder. She wore no jewelry, no carefully chosen dress, only a tailored black coat and the steady calm of a woman who had already lost everything once and survived it. Elias and Camille were already inside. The moment her feet touched the courthouse steps, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel arrived moments later. The cameras surged toward him, hungry. He was polished, as always, in a slate-gray suit, his smile smooth, practiced. He turned toward the press, gave them a look that was half charm, half indignation, and said, "I have always supported Sarah. It breaks my heart to see her unravel like this." The words slid over Sarah like ice. Inside the courtroom, she sat at the front beside Marcel, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Across from her, Daniel conferred with his legal team. From a distance, he looked untouched, unbothered even, as if this were just another performance. The opening statement stung. Daniel's lawyers painted her as a passionate but unstable creative, too naive to understand the business she had stepped into, prone to emotional outbursts, and now seeking to shift blame after failing to manage her own affairs. They referenced old emails, out-of-context fragments from late nights and broken days, words she barely remembered writing. Sarah felt her heart thud hard in her chest. She closed her eyes. Breathe. This was not about defending her worth. It was about telling the truth. When she stood to testify, the room shifted. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. She did not speak in abstractions. She brought dates, documents, names. She explained the projects, the forged contracts, the altered timelines. She laid each piece down like stone, measured, patient, undeniable. When the opposing lawyer questioned her mental state, she did not flinch. "Yes," she said, "I fell apart, but not before he dismantled everything I built." She turned toward the jury, her voice low. "This is not about love turned sour. This is about control, about erasure. He did not just take my work. He made me doubt I had ever done it myself." The room held its breath. Camille's exposé was released that same evening. It began quietly with the line, "He sells trust, and he profits from the silence that follows." The piece traced Daniel's long history of calculated deception, not just financial, but personal. Anonymous testimonies were woven throughout. A former intern who had been threatened with legal action after challenging contract discrepancies, a gallery owner who had signed a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for what she called dignified silence. The article spread quickly. By morning, it had been picked up by national media. Social media erupted. People who had once praised Daniel's vision began issuing quiet retractions. Sponsorships were withdrawn. Institutions he once boasted affiliations with issued statements of concern. Back in court, Daniel's expression began to change. The smile faltered, the charm thinned. For the first time, he looked smaller. Sarah watched him, not with triumph, but with distance. He no longer held any part of her. He was simply a man in a suit, cornered by the truth. She turned away before the verdict came. She had already heard what mattered. The verdict came quietly on the third day of deliberation, announced in a courtroom that felt suddenly too small for the weight it carried. Daniel Moreau was found guilty on multiple counts: fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary trust. The sentence would come later, but the message was clear. The man who had built his empire on charm and illusion had finally been seen for what he was. There were no gasps, no applause, just a collective exhale. Sarah remained still as the judge read the decision. Her hands rested gently in her lap, fingers loosely interlocked. She did not smile. There was no satisfaction in watching someone fall, only relief in knowing she would no longer be buried beneath what he had built. Outside, reporters waited, hoping for a statement, a moment of raw emotion they could sculpt into headlines. But Sarah slipped out through the side entrance with Marcel, moving unnoticed through the alley behind the courthouse. The sky was pale with late afternoon light, and the chill in the air was no longer cruel, just honest. She returned to the countryside soon after, to the small room under the eaves of Henri and Margot's cottage, where the smell of lavender still clung to the curtains, and the earth still held her name in silence. The newspapers filled themselves with the story in her absence. She did not read them. Camille sent occasional updates, but Sarah asked her to keep them brief. The truth had been spoken. That was enough. Still, the scars did not vanish. Her firm was gone. Clients who once courted her disappeared during the scandal's height and returned now with softened tones and carefully worded proposals. One even sent flowers, an extravagant arrangement that wilted after 2 days on the kitchen table. She turned them all down. It was not bitterness that drove her decision, but clarity. She no longer needed to reclaim the world that had once applauded her. That world had proven too easily swayed, too hungry for stories it could twist and discard. What she needed now could not be given by press releases or partnerships. One morning, as she raked fallen leaves behind the cottage, Margot appeared beside her with 2 mugs of coffee. They stood together in the brittle quiet of autumn, steam curling into the air between them. "You have your name back," Margot said, her voice low. "But that was never the part they truly took from you." Sarah nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The fields stretched far and gold, untamed and waiting. "No," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "The part they tried to take was my authorship, of my work, of my life." Margot handed her a mug. "Then write it again, on your own terms." That night, Sarah sat by the window, her sketchbook open on her knees. She did not draw buildings, not yet. She drew a single tree, tall and quiet, its roots exposed and reaching. And beneath it, with careful strokes, she wrote, "Still standing." The letter arrived in winter, long after the leaves had turned to bone and the fields lay sleeping beneath frost. It came folded neatly inside a plain envelope, the handwriting on the front familiar, painfully so. No return address, just her name, written with a hesitance that betrayed the hand behind it. Sarah knew before opening it who it was from. There was a particular precision in the way he wrote her name, like someone afraid of spelling it wrong, not out of forgetfulness, but reverence or guilt. She waited 3 days before reading it. She sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a thick wool shawl Margot had woven for her, the letter unopened in her lap. Snow fell softly outside, blurring the trees into watercolor shapes. Finally, she slit the envelope with the edge of a butter knife, her movements calm and measured, as if the contents might burn if handled too quickly. The letter was long. Daniel's tone was sorrowful, filled with a strange mix of remorse and self-preservation. He wrote of the sleepless nights, the hollow corridors of the prison, the endless hours replaying what he had done. He spoke of their early days, the pavilion, the studio, the lake house, and claimed that the love he had felt for her then had been real. But so had his fear, his envy, his inability to stand beside her without feeling smaller. "You were too bright," he wrote, "and I did not know how to love without trying to own what I admired." Sarah read the letter once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her bed, beneath a linen handkerchief she never used. She did not cry. She did not feel hatred or triumph or sadness, only a quiet ache for the girl she had been when she first believed his love was shelter and not shadow. That night, she opened her journal and wrote, "Forgiveness is not unlocking someone else's chains, but freeing myself from mine. I do not owe him peace. I owe myself freedom." She paused, then added, "I choose not to carry him anymore." There was no ceremony in her decision, no dramatic release or cleansing wind, just the quiet, solid choice to let it end. Not to forget. She would never forget, but to walk forward without looking back. In the days that followed, she found herself sleeping more deeply. Her breath came easier in the mornings. The dreams that once woke her with a start began to change, less chaotic, more grounded, like the soil she had turned with her own hands. The letter remained in the drawer, unread again, not out of denial, but out of peace. She had heard all she needed, and she had nothing more to say. Spring returned like a soft exhale, breathing color back into the hills and coaxing green from every crevice. Sarah watched it unfold slowly from the coast, where the wind tasted of salt and beginnings. The cottage she had moved into overlooked a quiet stretch of rocky shoreline, where waves lapped steadily against stone and nothing ever felt hurried. She had found the place with Elias on a morning spent driving without destination. They had passed fields thick with wild fennel and rows of broken stone walls before the land opened into a small bluff facing the sea. The house was old, half forgotten, ivy crawling over its eaves. But something about it felt familiar, unfinished, but full of promise. Together, they restored it. He repaired the roof and reinforced the foundations. She cleaned out the sunroom and turned it into a studio, its wide windows catching the morning light like open arms. He planted vegetables and citrus trees on the southern slope. She designed a greenhouse that curved like a seashell and collected rain in silence. There were no declarations between them, no attempt to name what grew quietly between shared meals and long walks at dusk. They understood each other in a way that did not require words, two people who had been broken differently and yet found a rhythm in the rebuilding. They laughed sometimes, not often, but enough. Sarah's studio remained small. She took only the projects that felt right: community centers, garden spaces, eco-shelters near forests and rivers. She met with clients barefoot, often with dirt beneath her nails, and explained her designs with the patience of someone who no longer needed to impress. On her desk sat a single model, a small house, its walls lined with living moss, its roof slanted to welcome both rain and light. The words carved gently along its base read, "Sustainability begins within." It was not just a motto, it was a memory, a truth carved not in wood or paper, but in her. Some evenings she would sit outside the studio while Elias lit the lanterns along the path. The sound of the sea drifted up in waves. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they simply sat, and sometimes, in the quiet between one breath and the next, Sarah would feel it, the pulse of something steady and whole, rising softly beneath her ribs, not joy, not certainty, but something older, something like peace,